Welcome. Thanks for being here this evening. Berkshire Green Drinks is organized and sponsored by Berkshire Environmental Action Team, also known as BEAT. If you don't already know about us, you can find out more on our website, or you can grab one of these end-of-year newsletters. Yeah, we're a small environmental nonprofit based in Pittsfield. Who am I? Oh, I'm Chelsea Simmons. I work for BEAT. Next week we have another event happening on Wednesday evening at the Berkshire Athenaeum, the Pittsfield Library, and it's just about pollinators and no mow May. We're going to hear from Jim McGrath from the city of Pittsfield about some just planting initiatives that they're doing here in Pittsfield. We'll also hear from Bruce Wynn over here, who is a BCC professor, about their also another pollinator initiative. They're just trying to remove all the lawns on the Berkshire Community College campus. Yeah, right, that's awesome. And there will be a prize giveaway and a silent auction. So yeah, you can learn more about that on our website, thebeatnews.org. For everyone on Zoom, if you could please stay muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, you can throw those in the chat at any time, and I'll make sure to relay that to Elizabeth, our speaker this evening. So I think that is everything, and I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth, and she can introduce herself further. Oh.
Okay, awesome. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Elizabeth Barnes. I work for the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources on invasive species outreach, primarily forest insects, one of which I'm going to talk to you about today. So I am going to tell you about the spotted lanternfly, but first, I wanted to go over a little bit about what invasive species are and clear up just a couple quick misconceptions about them. So a lot of people get non-native and invasive mixed up. They'll use them interchangeably when really they are different things. So a non-native species is any organism that's moved from one area to a new area, typically by people, and then is able to establish out in the wild. Could have a positive impact, could have a neutral impact, could have a negative impact. That's not part of the definition. Whereas an invasive species is an organism that, again, moved from one area to a new area, usually by people, establishes in the wild, and causes harm to people and or the ecosystem. So that harm part is really important in our definition of an invasive species. And I've got a couple examples here. So on the top, I have this picture of a lovely apple tree. Apple trees are not originally from North America, so brought here from somewhere else. They are established out in the wild. So I know I've certainly been hiking out in the woods and come across an apple tree. Now, typically there might be a cellar hole nearby. Occasionally you find an old abandoned orchard, so there's a bunch of them. But usually it's only a few growing on their own. So they're not really pushing out native species. The flowers can provide resources for pollinators. The apples are, well, we like them. Animals also like them. So they're just a non-native species. They're not invasive. Now, in contrast, the bottom photo is of the tree of heaven. I took this in Fitchburg. It is growing out of a storm drain. They are very, very tenacious. So tree of heaven, also not originally from North America, well established in the wild. You will find them growing in dense patches in some places. So they're pushing out or at least preventing native species from growing. They don't provide any food for native organisms, so most native insects can't eat them. And they do things like this. So they'll grow into drain pipes. They'll try and grow into pipes with their roots and foundations, and that can actually damage that infrastructure. So harmful to the environment, harmful to people. Tree of heaven is definitely invasive. Now, what do we do with invasive species? So there's a few different stages when we're dealing with invasive species. So first off, if we're able to catch it early enough, once it's in the US, we will try to get rid of it. That's the best way to prevent serious harm. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't, depends on a lot of factors. If we catch it early enough, if, what is the biology of the species? Some are just easier to contain than others. Then if we can't stop it, if we can't totally get rid of it, we will try to slow it down. And this can potentially keep it contained. In some instances, we've been successful with this, but even if it doesn't, buys us time to develop better management strategies, buys people time to figure out how they're going to deal with it and to prepare for it, and also to just understand its biology. A lot of times invasive species behave totally differently in their introduced range than they do in their native range. So if we're very frequently starting from scratch, sometimes these are organisms that in their native range are so rare or infrequently seen that people don't even really study them. So there's no information other than it has a Latin name and that's it. So what do we do then once it's more widespread and it's basically here to stay? Well, at that point, we think about, all right, what are our long-term strategies? And there's some active management that we can do. So if you have, say, a street tree that you want to protect from a specific invasive species, you can do that, but usually you have to kind of keep that up. Now, there are other strategies that we try and do for more passive or verging on passive management. And those are things to try and basically get those species back in balance in the ecosystem, because that's the issue. It's not that invasive species are inherently bad organisms, it's just that they are out of whack in the ecosystem here. So if we can restore that balance, they're fine. They're just like the apple tree that I talked about before. They're not a big deal. So we do that in a bunch of different ways. Can't get into it in great detail here. Happy to answer more questions about it later. I will talk a little bit about this predator bullet point a little bit later. But I want to get into spotted lanternfly, the thing that you're here to hear about tonight. So just to give you some background first off, spotted lanternflies are invasive sap-sucking insects. They are true bugs, which means even though they look an awful lot like butterflies and moths, they're actually more closely related to things like cicadas or plant hoppers. They are rarely a problem in their native range. Sometimes they have minor outbreaks, but for the most part, they're just kind of there at low levels. You occasionally run into them. They're also invasive in Korea and Japan, and that's actually where we were getting a lot of our initial information about them. But when they got here in 2014 on some imported stone, they behaved a little bit differently. So some of the early issues we thought we were going to have with them don't seem to be panning out. Now, that doesn't mean that when they reach a new part of the country, they won't suddenly start causing those same issues. But at the moment, it seems like they're behaving differently here. So I do, before I continue, want to include this one final thing, which is that there's still a lot we need to learn about spotted lanternfly. I will give you the most up-to-date information that I can today. I am always updating this PowerPoint, though. We are always learning more about them. So what I really recommend to people with spotted lanternfly, with most other new invasive species, listen to what I have to say today, but if you ever have to deal with them, go out, do your own research, contact us if you have questions, because I guarantee a year from now, something in what I'm telling you today is going to change, just because we're always learning more about them. Okay, so let's get into what they actually look like. They look quite different over the course of their life. So the early instar spotted lanternflies are pretty small. They are black with white spots. They come out in around May to July. You can see my thumb in that photo. For those of you actually here in person, here's my thumb to give you an idea of the scale. Most people don't notice them at this stage. They're fairly nondescript. Sometimes they confuse them with ticks, but you usually don't notice them. Later on in the summer, around July through September, they become a little bit brighter, a little bit more noticeable. They kind of look like a ladybug with a long nose. And at this point, they've got that red color, they've got black spots still, white spots still. But the one that you are going to see most photos of are the adults. And this is also because that's what most people notice. The adults have wings, so they're flying around. They are much bigger, and they've got those brightly colored, those spots on the wings, much more flashy. About the size of the end of your thumb. I've got some pictures with some grapes later, so you can see really a good comparison of the size. So the adults have spots on the first 2/3 of their wings, kind of a lacy pattern at the end, fairly dull color when their wings are closed, except for, if you can see, there's a little red spot right here under their eyes. That's actually the base of their antennas. That's the base, and then there's like, it looks like a little hair coming out of it, and that's the antennas. They're pretty different from a lot of other insects you're more used to seeing in that regard. Okay, so if they are in flight, if they are dead or dying, or sometimes they'll just kind of flare their wings when they're at rest on a tree, you'll be able to see those bright flashy colors that are in all the photographs of them. It has a streak of this sort of orangey red color with spots, a swoosh of white and black at the tip. And in that first photo, you'll notice that bright, bright yellow abdomen. So when females are getting ready to lay eggs, their abdomens swell way up and turn that yellow color. This one is pretty mad at me. That's why you can see her wings. All the other lanternfly in the area were starting to lay eggs at that point. So that's what she wanted to be doing, not being held for a photograph. So there are a lot of lookalikes of, sorry, what? I don't remember if I squished her after or not. I should have squished her if I didn't. She might have escaped. They're very flighty and they have very powerful legs, so they'll hop away sometimes. So there are a lot of lookalikes of spotted lanternfly, and I show you this not because I expect all of you to walk away from here as like experts at insect ID, but because I want you to see, you know, if you encounter something that you think looks like spotted lanternfly, get a picture, send it our way. We'll be able to tell you what it is. You don't necessarily need to panic immediately. Tiger moths and underwing moths in particular look very similar to lanternfly if you don't have them side by side. Okay, spotted lanternfly egg masses are one of the big reasons why they've been able to spread so well. They look like just mud. They look like nothing. They're this gray-brown color, about 1.5 inches long, covered with this brown putty-like coating, and each one of those contains between 30 to 50 egg masses. Or excuse me, 30 to 50 eggs. So if one of those gets transported to a new area, that's potentially 30 new spotted lanternfly hatching out in the spring. Usually they start laying them around mid-September. It seems to be tied to day length, but we're still trying to actually prove that because we see them consistently laying eggs at the same time year after year after year, regardless of temperature. But starting in that mid-September point until the first hard frost of the year, you really want to be careful, really want to be checking over your vehicles if you're in an area where there's a heavy population of lanternflies, so you don't accidentally bring one of these home with you. Again, there's a lot of lookalikes for spotted lanternfly egg masses. Once again, I don't expect you to be able to ID all of these. Spongy moth egg masses, which are also invasive, look pretty similar. A bunch of different funguses, lichens look similar as well. So again, take a photo, send it our way. We can let you know what it is. All right, now let's get into the biology of these things. So spotted lanternflies are sap feeders. They've got this little straw for a mouth that they stick through the bark of the plant into the tree and drink the sap from it. You can see that right here, sticking directly into that tree. And they, unfortunately, feed on over 100 different species of plants. They are really, really, really not picky. This is everything from something as small as basil to something as big as a maple tree. Now, they do have preferences, and those preferences shift over the course of the season. Earlier in the year, we tend to see them on smaller plants like roses, perennials. In Massachusetts, we also have been seeing them a lot on bittersweet and poison ivy, of all things. Later in the summer, they move on to those bigger plants, so black walnut, birch, willow, maples, sumac, things like that. However, for basically the whole summer, so basically that whole growing season, you can find them on grape and tree of heaven. Those are their absolute favorites. Now, tree of heaven, we don't care. They can have it. I've already gone over. We don't like tree of heaven. Grape is more of a concern. The actual impact that the lanternfly are having on these plants is going to vary by a lot of different factors, but there are 3 that seem to be particularly important. So first off, what species of tree is it? Some species are more easily affected than others. Secondly, how healthy is that plant? It's in good shape. It's easier to deal with heavy lanternfly feeding than if it's already weakened from something else. And then finally, just how many lanternflies are there? A couple, probably not a big deal. Hundreds, which we do see in some of the more heavily infested areas, that starts to be more of a problem. Now, the good news, which I don't get to give a lot of when I'm talking about invasive species, is that most host plants, it seems to be having a relatively minor impact on. It may weaken the plant, particularly if there's really, really heavy feeding, but on its own, if the plant is healthy, we see them springing back. So people will see heavy feeding on basil in their gardens, they'll wilt a little bit, the lanternflies move on. Mostly they seem to perk back up unless there was something else wrong with the basil. However, if that's combined with disease, drought, construction, many years of insect feeding, other insects, all of these different things, there's concern about what that's going to end up doing to these plants, because you have one thing that's weakening the plant and then another thing that's weakening the plant and then another and then another and another, and those have the potential to add up over time. So it's something that we're keeping a close eye on. And that's, like I said, come back for updates later. Now, there are some exceptions. Tree of Heaven, again, who cares? Black walnut and grape, black walnut saplings, excuse me, and grape can all be really seriously impacted by spotted lanternfly. We see early yellowing of the leaves, you see dieback of branches, and death of the entire plant. Also, weeping of sap from the bark and the buildup of this slime flux at the base of the tree. So slime flux is this frothy, foamy, fermented mess. It's really gross, quite unpleasant. If it's on Tree of Heaven, I don't know how many of you have dealt with it in person, but Tree of Heaven has this rancid peanut butter smell to it. So you get the slime flux with the rancid peanut butter smell. It's pretty awful, even from a good distance away. Grapes I wanted to particularly highlight. So when they're feeding on grapes in large numbers, and remember I said we'd have that comparison. So here's some grapes, and then all of these little things on this vine, those are all spotted lanternfly. You can see they're a little bigger than the grapes themselves. They can kill the vines in as little as a single season, and the vines that survive tend to produce grapes. They don't taste very good. It also reduces photosynthesis, reduces sap flow, storage of carbohydrates and nitrogen, and makes them generally more susceptible to winter stresses, so you could end up losing the vine even if it survived the summer. There's also some concern from growers about what it's going to mean for harvest, because the lanternflies tend to swarm in these large numbers right at the same time as they're trying to harvest the grapes. So there's potential for spread. If they're hitchhiking on vehicles, there's potential of how do you sort out the lanternflies from the grapes if they accidentally get knocked in? So that's something that's actively being looked into to try and make that easier for them to deal with. And I did want to focus on the grapes themselves, particularly for a moment, because I think sometimes people can say like, oh, I don't grow grapes, and grapes are kind of weedy in my yard. I don't want to actually have to deal with them, so I don't care. But, there are still people in Massachusetts that commercially and privately in their own gardens grow grapes for table grapes, for wine. Grapes are also really important in some places for bank stabilization along streams, both in urban and rural areas. This is probably the least important thing on the list, but they have a pleasant smell. And I know when I go hiking, it always is just kind of wonderful to come across some grapes with that wonderful smell. And so, it's a loss if we start to lose that, as well as all these other things. Animals also use it for food, for shelter. Birds use them for nesting sites. Pollinators actually do visit grapes, as well as there are some types of caterpillars that rely on grapevines for food. So there's a lot of different ways that they contribute both to people economically, for people just improving their lives, and also for different animals in our ecosystem. Now, there are also some indirect effects from spotted lanternfly. They produce something called honeydew, which is this sticky, sugary liquid that is their excrement, for lack of a better word, gets all over everything underneath them. If you've ever had an aphid outbreak in your garden and you feel that sticky stuff underneath, that is honeydew. So imagine taking those aphids, scaling them up to the size of a grape, keeping the same density. You can imagine what volume of this sticky, sugary liquid you get. Bees love it, hornets love it, ants love it, so you tend to get an uptick of those in your yard. And actually, in Pennsylvania, they've been seeing that the bees will sometimes collect enough of it that it changes the character of the honey. So peak collection tends to be in August, September, and October. That's when the adults are kind of grouped together. Adults make the biggest volume of honeydew, so this makes sense. Good news is that the bees seem to do fine on it. They haven't seen any issues with that yet, so at least that's one thing we hopefully don't have to worry about. It has a smoky smell and a darker color. I've got here a jar of just regular old normal Massachusetts honey that I got at the Big E. And then on the other side, the spotted lanternfly honey. So you can see it's much, much darker. The flavor also can be changed, and it depends on a couple things. So first, what's the ratio of what the bees are collecting to the honeydew that they're collecting? So if you've ever had, say, buckwheat honey or chestnut honey, that has that distinctive flavor because it's primarily from the bees collecting from those plants. Same deal here. It also depends on what the spotted lanternfly is feeding on. So basically you have flavor changes going from the tree to the lanternfly, to the honeydew, to the bees, to the honey, and then to us. And the flavor, I like this description. It's from Sarah Thompson, who is a professional baker. You can find the full article in Philadelphia Magazine if you want to read more. But she said, it's very oaky, like oak barley. It's very woodsy. It tastes like fall and wet leaves. It's like the epitome of autumn. Now, some of you might be hearing that and thinking like, oh, that sounds interesting. I kind of want to try that. Some of you might be hearing that and thinking that sounds gross. I don't want that in my honey. That's awful. And that's about the reaction that people have. So I happen to like it. I don't want to replace my honey with it, but I like to have it in my cabinet, and I'll put it in like yogurt or things like that. It's sort of a different flavor. It's kind of more like molasses. Whereas some of the people I work with despise it. They got a jar of it. Someone gave it to them. They're like, here, you take it. You like it. I don't even want this in my house. All right. So that sooty mold, or excuse me, that honeydew also has another effect. It can grow sooty mold, which, if you've never seen it, is this dark black mold. It can get on leaves of plants under where the lanternfly are feeding. Also, if you notice here, the top two steps on this porch are kind of black and shiny. The bottom one is a paler color and more of a matte color. They had to actually power wash their steps, and they did this multiple times over the course of the summer because that honeydew and sooty mold kept getting on their steps again and again and again. So you can imagine what that would be like if you had, a bench under one of these trees, if your car was usually parked under one of these trees. It's just an added nuisance that makes it less pleasant to be outside. And that is a big part of lanternfly, is they reduce people's quality of life. You get these big numbers of them outside. Unfortunately, it's often right when a lot of orchards and farms are looking to do pick your own. And so people who might not really like bugs then are going to these orchards and getting swarmed by these insects, and maybe they don't want to go there again. There's also been issues where people have planned autumn outdoor weddings, and then the lanternfly show up. So that disrupts it again. So, it's not to be dismissed, I think. Okay, so where are they? So this map shows two different things. Don't panic, it's not in every single one of these places yet. So the blue shows areas where we have found individual lanternflies. Those might be something like someone travels to a heavily infested state, they come back, they park their car in their garage, they wake up the next morning, there's a dead lanternfly in their garage. So they call us. We look into it, we don't see any more in the area, we say, okay, this is probably just a single hitchhiker. In contrast, the orange are municipalities that have lanternfly in them. So that is in, unfortunately this list has expanded since last year, so I'm gonna have to read off the map. It is Holyoke, Springfield, Agawam, Worcester, Shrewsbury, Fitchburg, Southborough, Ashland, Chelmsford, Weston, and Wellesley. So all of those places have small areas within them with established lanternfly populations, and unfortunately, none of the other states that have been having to deal with this
have been able to get rid of them once they're there. So right now, what we're trying to do is we're trying to knock back the populations, trying to buy ourselves some more time, but it's very, very unlikely unless something major changes, and I don't know, maybe it will, but unless something major changes that we will be able to totally get rid of them in these places. So how do they get there? There's a bunch of different ways they can spread. They can spread on outdoor furniture. Believe it or not, that first photo of the bench has actually 2 egg masses on it, at least that you can see. They can spread on plants. You know, people do their best to make sure they're not transporting them when they're moving plants around, but sometimes things slip through the cracks. Firewood, this is a big way. A lot of different invasive species are spread around. Vehicles, I've mentioned this briefly before. That's another big way. There's actually a wind tunnel study that was done showing that lanternflies can cling on at even high speeds. They have powerful little legs. It would be cool if they weren't such a problem otherwise. But good places to check are in your wheel wells and then also by your windshield wipers. They'll kind of shelter in there and then stick on the highway. So all these things can move lanternfly around. And I did want to highlight the egg masses in particular again, so we can find them on pretty much anything outside. So the base of tree, tops of tree, firewood, outdoor furniture, camping equipment, rusty metal, cinder blocks, cushions, vehicles, all sorts of things. The weirdest picture I've seen for lanternfly egg masses was on a light bulb, which I'm sure once that got turned on, those eggs were fried, but it does show you the range of surfaces they're willing to lay their eggs on. There are some management options, don't have time to get into it, but I did want you to know they're there. We have a website that has specifics about the management in it. There's pros and cons for each of them. Okay, something else that often gets asked is, what about removing tree of heaven? Unfortunately, this will not get rid of the lanternfly. They don't need it to survive. There's other trees that they can use to survive. So that's not going to solve your lanternfly problem. Also, tree of heaven is extremely difficult to remove, so it's not like this is an easy lift. You know, you cut it down, you do it wrong, or even sometimes you do it right, you have a whole thicket of them sprouting up. Now, that said, oh, and also I did want to caution there are some health issues potentially associated with the sap, so you do want to look into protecting yourself from that if you try to remove it. It is an invasive plant. If your goal is to remove invasive plants and you do your research, you know, go for it. I'm never going to discourage that, but just know it's not going to solve your lanternfly problem. Another question we often get asked is, what about native predators? Does anything eat them? And they do. Ants eat them, spiders eat them, stink bugs, birds, all sorts of different things. But what you'll notice about all of these different animals is these are creatures that kind of eat bugs of a certain size that they come across. They're not looking for lanternfly specifically. They'd be just as happy with a grasshopper. So what we would really need to knock down their population is something that affects a lot of insects and helps keep their population under control, which are very, very specialized predators that only go after those insects and nothing else. If you've ever had tornado hornworms in your garden with those little cocoons on their backs, parasitoids, same idea. And some people here are working with researchers in their native range to identify some of these with the goal that we're not going to get rid of lanternfly with them, but maybe we can get them back in balance in the ecosystem. However, there's a lot we need to know first. So we need to make sure they're not going to affect any non-target species. This is an extremely long and extremely thorough process. You know, they don't get released if that's an issue at all. We look for something else. So that's going to take a while to figure out. There's also some native funguses, but we also need to figure out how effective that actually is. And again, if there'll be impact on non-target species. So both of these things are kind of maybe in the long term, they might help us. In the short term, not going to do much. Okay, and now wrapping up. If you see lanternfly or any other invasive insect, please tell us about it. So get a picture, note where you are, and send it in. When you get that picture, I do also want to say, particularly with lanternfly, they will fly away, they will hop away really easily. So don't try and catch it first, don't try and kill it, don't try and get closer to it. Just say like, it's right there, stop, take a picture. This is what I do when I'm trying to identify something. Then you can kind of get closer if you want to, but get that photo first. Now, if you don't have a photo, that's totally fine. We still want those reports, but pictures can be really helpful to us. If you're not sure, please still send in a report. We are happy to get those. As long as it's a good faith report, all that's going to happen is we'll take a look at it, we'll tell you what it is, and give you a fun fact about it. We are all bug nerds reviewing these, so sometimes we get something that's like a cool moth that we wouldn't get to see otherwise. It's great. Please keep sending those in if you're worried they might be an invasive species. Finally, I always include this. If you see something weird, and by that I mean suddenly there's a type of bug all over the place you've never seen before, or a bunch of the same type of trees are dying and there's no obvious cause, ask someone about it. That could be us. That could be these lovely people here. That could be, the professor at the local community college who's a biologist, your friend who's really into nature. It doesn't matter who, just ask someone about it, because this is how we found out about a lot of invasive species we had no idea were even in the country. 9 times out of 10, it's just going to be the population fluctuation and an outbreak of something. But that one time, it can be a big deal if we catch it early. I also wanted to mention we have resources on our website you can download. If you live or work in Massachusetts, we're also happy to mail them to you for free. We have a newsletter, comes out once a month, 5 bullet points or less of timely forest pest information with links out to further reading if you want it. You can either sign up here, or if you want to give me your email address after, I'm happy to go and sign you up that way. And with that, I will take any questions that you might have. Yes.
My daughter in Pennsylvania had a birch tree that was completely infested with them one year. Next year, there were none there. So, can you speak to the natural cycle of these?
Oh, can you repeat the question? Sure. Yep. Okay. So the question was for people online that in Pennsylvania, there are some areas where they'll see them all over one tree one year, and then they seem to be gone the next year. And that is something we're looking into. What we're seeing more frequently is that there'll be like a specific tree that they are on year after year after year. But particularly last year, it seems like maybe there was a dip in population in some areas, particularly close to where it started. But there's a lot of argument about whether or not there was actually that decrease in population, and if there was, what caused it. So that is something we're still looking into. But if there is that natural cycle, that would be great. But we just don't know yet. So, any other questions? Yes.
Your map looks pretty spotty in Massachusetts. Is there any indication that in those spotty locations that there's also a range expansion?
Sure. So the question was, the map of Massachusetts looked kind of spotty, and if there's any indication that in those spots there's a range expansion. I would say it's hard to tell whether there's a range expansion or if some of those areas are just places that are more likely to get spotted lanternfly introduced over and over again. So for example, around Springfield, there's kind of a cluster of towns, but I think it's hard for us to tell if that was one introduction that's since spread out, or if it's just because Springfield, it's a big city, it's got a lot of people going in and out constantly. So maybe, someone in Springfield and then some of the neighboring towns also brought it in repeatedly.
What are some of the states that are heavily infested?
Pennsylvania has it pretty bad, kind of right up through the eastern seaboard from Pennsylvania up. New York has it pretty bad. There's some states actually in the Midwest that have it now, but it's not like the whole state. It's more like here where there's just a couple spots. For example, Indiana has a couple areas with it. But yeah, off the top of my head, those are the ones that seem to have the biggest outbreaks. New Jersey as well has had a lot of them. Yes?
Another question is, you mentioned, if I heard it right, that the behavior in the U.S. is a little different than the behavior in its native range in Japan. And please correct me if I heard it wrong. So my question is, are there any genetic variations that have been detected, or any genetic changes that have been detected that may be responsible for that difference in behavior?
So the question was, I had mentioned earlier that there were some changes in behavior from the native range to the U.S. and if that might be associated with genetic changes. So first, so they're actually invasive in Japan and Korea. They're native to Southeast Asia, so sort of southern China in that area, but there's a section of China where you don't find them, which is why they never before spread up into Korea and Japan, and they're just getting them now, so they're invasive there. In terms of whether it's genetic or not, it's another very good and hard question. I don't think we have any evidence of that yet. That doesn't mean it's not the case necessarily. Sometimes with invasive species, we see it that there'll be just a few individuals that get introduced into a new range. So any particular genetic quirks of those individuals end up being magnified in the whole population in the way that you wouldn't necessarily see in their native range. Don't know if that's the case with lanternfly or not yet. Another reason why they can behave differently is they're just encountering other organisms. So other types of trees, different types of climate that might be better or worse for them. So for example, they were seeing in Korea that they were going after fruit trees, so apples, stone fruit, and so that's something we were really concerned about here. But so far what we've been seeing in the US is that they will swarm onto those fruit trees, be there for a little while, and then kind of disperse. But at least so far, we haven't seen any major damage for those. And so we don't know yet why there are those differences. It's, I know I said, the introduction seems like it's about 10 years, and that seems like a really long time. But in terms of research, you've only got one season to study them each time, so there's a lot of catching up that we've been trying to do. Any other questions? No, there's people. Oh no, there's not people behind the pole anymore.
If anyone has any questions online, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can also unmute, and I think we should be able to hear you. There were a few in the chat.
Oh, okay. Yes.
You have a plan of attack for this season?
Yeah, so we're working on it right now, working on figuring out what we're going to be doing. The way that we've been trying to knock them back, it differs depending on the site. So some areas we can use, there are insecticides that are really effective at killing them, but we can't use those at every site, obviously. We did a lot of egg mass scraping this winter, which actually that's something I should mention. We scraped over 7,000 egg masses. I believe it's more. They think they've done more since they gave me that last count, but quite a few egg masses. And we actually have scraper cards that have information about them, and then you can also use them. You squish the egg mass with the back of the card, then you scrape them off the tree. You can do the same thing with like an ice scraper from your car as well. I've used that before. They work better or worse in different circumstances. I kind of like to have both available and tailor it to the tool, but these work pretty well. So if anyone wants them, got plenty here. So those are some of the big things. We have monitoring that we do throughout the state for areas that are high risk of introduction. And, we're also working on a campaign to get the word out more to people, because some invasive species, doing that monitoring is a better way to find out about them. We tend to see more of that. Some invasive species, like lanternfly, we actually get most of the finds from reports from the public, because they are so big and flashy, and because we don't have a good lure for them yet to actually draw them into our traps. So we really have to rely on just people keeping their eyes out for them. Yes.
We have a few questions online. The first one is, could you please tell us more about the impact on pollinators, especially bees and moths?
Sure. So for bees, I mean, the biggest impact that we've seen has been the collection of that honeydew, which in some places the honeydew is at its peak during times when there's not a lot of nectar. So I really hesitate to say this. So in some ways, it's good for the bees, but please note the bad things far outweigh that one small, very, very small good thing. Doesn't seem to have a negative effect on them from what we've seen. Same with hornets and yellow jackets, which I know people don't like yellow jackets, but if you want to keep, the pest insects down, you gotta have some yellow jackets as well. So we've seen them collecting it there. I don't know about anyone who has published anything about negative impacts on other pollinators beyond the potential issues with the loss of those grapevines in that floral resource. But otherwise, yeah.
And then another question is, what limits spotted lanternfly and its native range?
Ooh, good question. In the native range, it's something that's being studied because they're pretty, but they aren't a terribly remarkable insect in their native range, such that people hadn't really been looking into them before now. Some potential constraints are if it gets very, 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 very cold, it will kill them in a way where they either can't complete their life cycle or it can kill the egg masses. And I put that many varies because I don't want anyone to think that it's cold enough in Massachusetts for that to happen. It's not cold enough here. Like the predicted range is potentially up into the coast of Maine, so that kind of gives you an idea that it has to be really cold. There are some potential heat issues, but those are less severe for them. Also, those parasitoids just kind of knock down the numbers over and over again, such that it's harder for them to expand. But like I said, there's really limited information about what's keeping them where they are in their native range, or really much about them at all.
And then someone is wondering, how have the other New England states been affected?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, one of the first ones, it's not New England. I know it's not New England, but in New York, we'll go with the Northeast as a whole. So in New York, you may have seen on the news last year and the year before, they hit New York City really badly. They were climbing up the skyscrapers. They're not that smart. They see something tall, they think it's a tree. They go for it. They see people, they think we're trees. They go for us. Actually, brief side note, you'll often see them on telephone poles because they'll land on the telephone pole, try to feed from it, realize it's not a tree, fly away, see the telephone pole again, think, oh, it's a tree, go back to it, land on it, try and feed on it. So they'll get sometimes stuck in this like loop. But yeah, they had high numbers there. Down into Pennsylvania, so again, it's not New England, but they're really only just starting to get into New England. So that's why I'm talking about these other states. In Pennsylvania, they saw really serious losses in their vineyards. And a lot of the vineyard owners there, for their vines that survived, they had to drastically increase the amount of pesticides they're spraying in order to kill the lanternflies to keep the vines alive. And so that's, there's a myriad of problems that causes. It's expensive. There's only so much you can apply before it starts affecting other things that you don't want to affect. So that's a big issue there. What else? I mean, those are some of the biggest ones. There's also the issue of trying to avoid transporting them. And so if you're a grower, then you have to take that time to inspect whatever you're shipping out, which can be costly for them. In people's everyday lives, I mentioned some of the examples of just that sticky honeydew on things, them being all over the place outside and kind of just disrupting people's daily lives. Yes.
I know a lot of what you talked about is being transported by people and things. Mm-hmm. Is there a sense of what kind of movement they can do on their own? Like when you're trying to remediate, do they kind of stick around a small localized area, or
Okay, that's a good question. So the question is, I've been talking a lot about people transporting them, what's sort of their natural spread on their own. There's a lot of debate about that, actually. So in sort of, typically they're going to move no more than a mile or two within where they were. So there's been kind of this slow creep out from the core where they were found in Pennsylvania. You can see there's this big spot there, and it's been progressively getting bigger over the years. However, some people have been arguing that they can get caught by the wind and get moved further distances. So that may be the case, but it's still under a lot of debate, and people are still trying to get evidence for that, and it can be tricky to prove that the lanternfly being carried by the wind is actually the lanternfly that came from this place versus lanternflies in this new place. But that can potentially greatly expand how far they can spread. But they're pretty, yeah, I mean, as with a lot of invasive species, on their own, they don't move very quickly. It's when people are moving them around that it drastically accelerates how fast they spread, which means we have less time to figure out what to do with them. Is there any more?
Yeah. Where else in the U.S. are spotted lanternfly problem, and then following that, are they in California?
So they are primarily on the East Coast in a couple areas in the Midwest so far, down to, I can't remember if Virginia is the furthest south or if there's one other state that's further south, but Massachusetts is the furthest north. Virginia, or a bordering state, is the general area is furthest south. They are not in California yet. California is very, very concerned about them, though. I don't have it in this slide set, but there's a map that shows predictions of where they're likely to be happy. Most of Massachusetts, they're likely to be happy. Most of the East Coast, into the Midwest. Once you get kind of into the plain states, closer to the Rocky Mountains, it's not as good habitat. Most of Texas, not so good. But then when you get to California, very good habitat for them. They're expected to be very, very happy there because of the host plants there, because of the weather that's there, because of all these things. So that's something that they're keeping an eye on. People from California come to all our spotted lanternfly meetings, and they're keeping close tabs on it. But yeah, if they ever got there, it would be devastating for the vineyards in California. So if you like California wine, there's another reason to try and slow down the spread of spotted lanternfly.
Any other questions here?
Which time was it in the Berkshires that it was noticed? Individual.
Let me go back to that slide because I don't know all the individual sightings off the top of my head. It looks like, I'm sorry, I can't read it, and I don't. Great Bear. Okay. Thank you. I grew up in Massachusetts. I still don't know all the town names without them being labeled. But yeah, that's where it was. And I mean, I will say too, on this map, just because something isn't shaded in, it's tricky with invasive species because just because we haven't gotten a report of something being somewhere doesn't mean it isn't there. It's just that nobody's noticed it there. So it's possible that they could be in other places that we just don't know about yet. Like I said, last summer, if I was giving this talk to you, there would have been 4 towns with spotted lanternfly. Then last fall, we more than doubled the number that we knew about it in. I think there's 11 now. I want to say 11 at this point. Don't quote me on that, though. But there's significantly more. Yes?
Not so much a question, but last summer we were in Norwalk, Connecticut, and it was just, they were swarming everywhere, driving in the windshield, falling.
Yep. Yeah, that seems to be the pretty typical experience once they reach that critical level of them. And oftentimes, what we've seen is they'll be at a low level for a few years, and then suddenly there's just this spike, and it seems like they're everywhere out of nowhere. So it's not usually, at least in terms of people's experience of them, like a gradual increase.
You said you racing with the target twice. You
put them in Pilsen or something, how do you wash them?
So if you do it really thoroughly, you can usually squash them all pretty well. But that said, if you want to be extra careful about it, you can scrape them into soapy water, or what's also really effective is rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer. You can just scrape them into there, and that'll kill them as well, like in a Ziploc bag or a little container or something like that. And the concern there is if you're just scraping them, that some of them might still survive on the ground. The egg masses themselves are about 1.5 inches long, although depending on the shape of what they're laying them on, they can be a little bit longer, but then they're narrower. We've seen a couple times in the field on vines that they laid their egg masses on. It's just like all one single line of eggs. So that was like several inches long, but typically they're about 1.5 inches. Sometimes they're covered, sometimes they're uncovered. So you see those little seed-like eggs. And kind of interestingly, and this is something no one's looked into yet, it's just like an observation, but when you find an uncovered egg mass, a lot of times you will find that covering somewhere else with no eggs in it. So it's almost like once they start laying the eggs, they have to complete that process and they'll just do it somewhere else.
I have a question. When do you expect the numbers to reach that critical level in Massachusetts to where they are just kind of like swarming?
That's hard to say. I'm not sure what it would be, partially because we have been doing those treatment efforts, so that hopefully will slow it down. But yeah, it's really hard to say when it'll hit that peak, and it's weather dependent too. So if the weather is particularly good for them, and you get more and more of them, might be sooner, might be later. If it's particularly bad. Anyone else have any questions?
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.